Yes, I am the attorney on campus, and I'm here, of course, to talk about a persistent problem, the school-to-prison pipeline. But it is a problem with a solution, and that solution is you. Of course, the school-to-prison pipeline is fed by the bodies of black children, particularly black boys, who are over-disciplined in the school process, which leads to them being suspended and expelled. And there's a correlation between poor academic performance and dropping out. And there's a correlation between dropping out of school and entering the criminal justice system. Now, to control the problem, or to solve the problem, of course, is daunting. And you have to ask yourself, how much courage do you have? Because it actually takes a great deal of courage to advocate for people who may break the rules, especially when in a social activism setting. Because it takes social activism to fight for those who are essentially voiceless. And we know in society that people of color, particularly, again, black boys and men, are particularly on the lower rung of having a voice and power in our criminal justice system. But what does it mean to actually represent people who have done something wrong? Because even in the school-to-prison pipeline, I know that was years ago. I know, can you believe that? That's me many years ago representing a client. In the school-to-prison pipeline, indeed, there are children who are blameless and are severely disciplined, who essentially do nothing but act like children. But for a great many of students, they actually do break the rules, but they are disciplined overly harshly. And when you have to advocate for that in a public setting, it causes some people to take pause. Because really, are we sort of championing the rule breaker? It's kind of difficult. But I heard from Camus Bell when he came to campus. That was him in September. That's him, me, and my son. And he talks about how the black community has sort of a collective guilt problem, something that the larger white community doesn't experience. So, for example, the larger white community doesn't feel responsible for a Ted Bundy. But as a black member of the community, we feel responsible for all the crimes our sisters and brothers commit, and we're embarrassed by someone like a Bill Cosby. But to cure the school-to-prison pipeline, you actually have to overcome this sense of embarrassment. Because, and I think Superintendent Travis Waters yesterday talked about it when he was a student at SHIP and he was performing poorly. And he mentioned that the professor had, pulled him aside and said, look, you're the only other one that looks like me here. You're going to have to do better. And that's because in society, everyone, since we're in the minority, everyone looks at us under a microscope and then extrapolates our behavior to the entire population. So we feel responsible. Now, we should feel responsible for one another. Am I my brother's keeper? But we shouldn't necessarily let that be a barrier to advocating for those youth who are in trouble. So, particularly with the school-to-prison pipeline, black children constitute 18% of the students, but they account for 46% of the students who are suspended more than once. And this over-disciplining of students actually begins in preschool. His little 3-year-old who has been suspended at least 5 times. And how does that happen? The Yale study, there was in 2016, the Yale Child Study wanted to examine preschool teachers' implicit bias. That is, they wanted to study whether really it was something, discipline was associated with race or not. And so what they did is they got 130 preschool teachers and they presented them with vignettes of school children, preschoolers, acting badly. Things like, oh, the kids were yanking toys away, or blurting out answers when they shouldn't, talking out of turn, throwing things, weren't amenable to being redirected easily. And then what they did to manipulate and control for sex and race, they used ethnically stereotypical names like LaToya and Deshaun, or Emily and Jake. And they also manipulated background information. Well, the children came from a single parent home, or maybe they were left in the care of others for long periods of time. The researchers then had some child actors reenacting some scenes, and asked the preschool teachers to rate the students' behavior and to recommend discipline. And what they found, regardless of the race of the teacher, whether the teacher was black or white, all their eyes essentially were trained on the black boys. That is, they were looking for certain behaviors. And as you know, in criminal justice, we have what's called a labeling theory. If you call a kid bad enough, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that the kid is going to be bad. Here, what they found was the preschool teachers had certain expectations that the black boys were going to act badly, and then they responded accordingly. So that's what the research shows. But you know what? I don't blame the teachers at all. I don't blame the teachers because presumably they grew up and were brought up in America. And America, our system of government, has systematically perverted the principles of democracy, particularly the one that says all men are created equal. Because with the original sin of slavery, what happened was religion essentially had to carve out of the human existence black people. That is, if you were a Christian slave owner and God made the human existence for you alone, you to be white people, then that meant the slave had to be an animal. And they turned to science. Politics turned to science to justify the inhumane treatment of the slave. The slave had to be a beast. And if the slave was a beast, well, that meant slavery was completely morally justified. Now, of course, because when the slaves came to America, and often they didn't speak English, come on in. And people had to use physical violence to control these bodies. Punishment, when it was meted out to the slave, because they were beast-like, the punishment had to be hard, it had to be excessive, and it had to be memorable. Because you wanted the violence not only to stay with the slave, but also act as a deterrent for others for acting out. So this marriage of bestiality and animal imagery, it's okay, come on in. Come sit over here. Yeah, sit down. Sit down. Sit over there. The animal imagery and the justification for it has real implications for today for the school-to-prison pipeline. But after slavery ended, after the Civil War and Congress enacted the 13th Amendment, they abolished slavery except upon conviction of a crime. And so the South was able to replace free slave labor with what's known as convict leasing. And that is where they took children. Yes, took children, and they rented them out for profit, particularly in the South, by private businesses and even the state. So for example, when forests needed to be cleaned out and roads needed to be paved. But unlike the times of slavery where black bodies had economic value, in convict leasing they had none. So they were seriously mistreated, and it didn't matter if they died. Now, also what you see around this time is the outgrowth of many laws that can ensnare children. So you'll see a lot of laws that, like for vagrancy or disrespectful gesturing. Hello, come on in, have a seat. Come on in. crimes that you could essentially, and that were vigorously persecuted against black children so that you could enslave them back as young as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the convict leasing scheme lasted, and it permeated America's mind into what juveniles and how juveniles should be treated. Because this is in the 30s, and by the time of the 1950s, and juvenile justice, first of all, starts essentially in the early 1900s in Chicago. And this is around the same time, as you know, children were assumed to be the property of their fathers, and they were really just disposable. But around the 1900s in Chicago, there starts in Cook County a movement to separate children from adults, not imprison them together, and to treat them differently. Particularly around the notion that kids will be kids. Like, how many people made mistakes when you were a child? Raise your hand. Okay. Hopefully you weren't locked up forever because of them. But there's, in the law, we kind of recognize the immaturity of the juvenile brain. And so in the 1900s, started a juvenile justice movement, and it coincided with the Great Migration from the South to the northern cities. So, for example, you had a lot of new migrants, if you will, black families moving from the South to Chicago at the same time that juvenile justice is becoming entrenched. And what happens is you get a lot of professionals who want to treat children and rehabilitate them, but it turns out that those services are only reserved for the white immigrant children, the children who tend to be Polish and Jewish and German. The black children around this time, they tend to be put in state-run institutions. And if you look at the justification for that, some of it makes sense. Well, the black community can't take care of itself. And that was true. As new migrants to the northern cities, we didn't have the infrastructure to take care of our own, especially youth in trouble. So some of that was true. But if you do a deep dive into the criminal justice notes, the professionals' notes at the time, you see that they're actually blaming the black children, the crimes that the black children commit, on their own inherent incorrigibility, on their own sense of willingness not to follow the norms of regular life. Whereas the white children, who were given rehabilitation and treatment options, they were seen to be victims of external factors, such as a bad home life or running around with delinquent peers. So this separation of children, even on the juvenile justice level, starts in the early 1900s, and it's exacerbated in the 1950s with the whole concept of juvenile delinquents. Now, I put little Richard up there because everyone knows with this little honky-tonk and his little hip gyrations, like this was big. If you look back at the history, and I'm sure that you're familiar with it, rock and roll was the music of the devil. You also had the delinquent celebrated in popular culture by the actor James Dean and the movies he made. And essentially in this post-World War II society that we have that was very economically prosperous, you had juveniles, teenagers who had disposable income. We had cars for every family that were starting to become very commonplace, and so there was a lot of mobility, and teens could go and make out and lovers lane and do other things in those cars. But there seemed to be a general sense that America was changing, and we were losing control of the children. And this had to do with sort of changing social status of women in the home, the family, the kids. And they started to really focus on delinquency. And in the 1950s, there was even a Senate commission looking for the causes of delinquency. And so this started this whole focus of how to treat the children. And it coincides at the same time with the backlash over the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. Now, this push for integration really did change the landscape for black children. Because essentially, according to the author Michelle Alexander, who writes in The New Jim Crow, when integration, the Southern elites essentially convinced all white people to see race as a social issue of power rather than a social class issue. And how this played out is that many systems, like for example, in Prince Edward County, Virginia, in response to the Brown decision, simply closed down the entire public school system. Now, their white children went to school in academies that they privately established, but for black children, there was no education at all for up to 5 or 6 years, just no school at all. Now, of course, that meant that when black children actually did start to integrate, the lower class whites were the ones most affected. Because obviously if you had money, your kids weren't going to public school. And so the lower class whites found now that they had to resist integration. They had to really focus on states' rights and reject federal intervention in local school policy, because this was now an issue of power. And they were powerless since they didn't have the money. So integration was at a loss. And the black kids who started to integrate, because they were, of course, of lower class, they were the most susceptible to criminal justice abuses. They were vulnerable. And it's because, of course, they already had a poor education. They already, at this point, because of this disruption of migration, were starting to experience broken and dysfunctional families. And they just didn't have the resources to fight the policies that would exclude them from American social intercourse. Now, of course, if I went to the National Archives and I started to research the backlash to Brown in newspapers, and I can't tell you the number of newspaper articles, editorials, letters to the editor that I read that essentially said, we cannot integrate black children and white children because the black boy wants nothing more than to feast on virgin white flesh. And this rape trope has, of course, been seared into Americans' history, not only starting with the Scottsboro Boys, which, of course, was the genesis of the fiction book To Kill a Mockingbird, both the movie and the book, but it was used to justify race riots, which I'm sure my colleague Dr. Gottschalk is talking about. It was used to justify the over-disciplining of black men. So, for example, as Kirsten told you, I was a death penalty defense lawyer. From 1930 to 1960, that's a 30-year period, 90% of the men executed for rape were black. Today, now, you have to kill somebody to get the death penalty. But in years past, and at times, of course, from the Scottsboro Boys on, rape was a capital offense. And all someone had to do was charge you with rape, and you were convicted, and you were executed for that. 90% of that were black men who were raped in the country. So the marriage of sort of bestiality and sex really comes through in all of these editorials, that the beast, the inherent bestiality of the black man, again, where racism is masked as science with sort of craniology studies, and look at how close they are to being apes. This animal imagery is very powerful, and it is directly tied to the school-to-prison pipeline. Because Philip Goff of UCLA did a study in 2014, and his expertise is in studying police response, use of force, and its relationship to race. And he did this study where he had subjects and research subjects, and he had them performing psychological tasks. And he had them performing psychological tasks while showing them pictures of black boys and white boys and Latino boys, and also showing them pictures of like large cats, such as lions, and apes. And then after showing them the apes, he would give them certain vignettes, certain descriptions of crimes. And he would give them pictures. And he would ask the research subjects to rate the subjects, the people in the photographs, to rate their age and their level of innocence. And what the study showed was that black boys were presumed to be 4.5 years older than their peers. So that is, a boy who was 10 was perceived to be 14. So that's the difference between a 4th grader and a 9th grader. And what that means in terms of criminal justice policy is that the black boy is seen as inherently autonomous in committing all of the criminal acts he's charged of doing, while the white child is seen as innocent and in need of help and redirection. So the black boy needs to be incarcerated to protect himself and most of us from his predatory nature, while the white child does not, needs our assistance and our support and our protection. It's society's natural inclination to protect children, but it is denied the black boy because of how they perceive to be his older, more responsible self. Now, of course, this continues on. Goff already, he confirmed what all of us knew. If you were alive and in the 80s, you knew about the Central Park 5 case. This was a terrible case of a woman jogger who was raped and beaten nearly to death with a rock. The Times, the media coverage at the time said, oh, these boys were out there as a night of wilding, they called it. Wilding, again, with the imagery of apes in the jungle. Wilding. Of course, they didn't do it, but they weren't cleared and exonerated until after at least the minimum sentence of 7 years had been served, some longer. But this whole notion of the black boy being out of control was further perpetuated in the 90s by Bill Clinton and the coining of the term super predator. And that justified locking juveniles up, many of color, for life without parole sentences, even if they didn't kill anybody. So you're 14, 15, you're going to be locked up forever. And so this is what the media and the politicians at the time, sort of making money really off the bodies of blacks, because the criminal justice industrial complex is a for-profit institution, particularly today. I'll never forget, those of us in Pennsylvania, you know, Luzerne County. There was a Cash for Kids scandal, and that is 2 juvenile judges made a pact to get kickbacks for how many bodies they put in a juvenile detention facility. Now, this wasn't particularly race-based because Luzerne County doesn't have that many black people, but just the fact that there's a quota that needs to be filled, and therefore you need bodies to fill it, means that criminal justice is going to do what we call net widening. We're going to increase our net by either changing laws to get more people to violate them, or drilling down in certain communities to make sure that, you know, we can catch everybody regardless of the minor nature of their crime. So this is the backdrop. Now, I should say that this changed, this life without parole. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court held that all juveniles sentenced to life without parole deserve at least a chance at a parole hearing. Deserve a chance. Doesn't mean they're going to get out, but they deserve a chance at least to be heard, that they've been rehabilitated. So, what can we do about this? How can we solve this problem? Number one, media. Media drives legislation. We want to change policy, you want to change laws, you've got to access the media. I give you an example of this, was the crack epidemic of the 1980s. Talked about crack babies, decimation of minority communities, and the knee-jerk reaction to that was first to militarize the medical problem of addiction, war on drugs, but also the harsh mandatory minimum sentences and life sentences for drug crimes indicated by the chart, where drug offenses you were going to serve so much longer. And that was just, it wasn't really based in any research. It was just there's a problem and this is how we're going to deal with it. So in order to interrupt the pipeline, stop the pipeline, you need to get the media and change the narrative. And the statistics, both cited by the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, all support the pipeline exists. Because people often say, well, I don't think that's real. And, well, you have these kids acting out, and that's just punishment that they're getting. But again, the studies all prove that if you have two sets of students, one white, one black, committing the same misdeed, the black child is going to be punished more harshly. The second thing, of course, is to go and get involved in your local communities. Go and actually look at the student code of conduct. How many people have done that? How many of you are like parents like me? And you get the thing that says you have to register your kid for school. And it says, read the student code of conduct. And you're click, 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 click. How many people have done that? Click, 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 click. I've never read it. I don't even know what's in there. Click, 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 click. I just wanted to get my kid registered. But listen, recently, I'm taking on this project to stop the school to prison pipeline in Harrisburg School District. And I actually read for the very first time the school code of conduct and the school discipline policies. And I learned how subjective all the definitions are. What really is disrespect? What really is profanity? You know, I think I know what profanity is, but do you know? You know, what does it mean to voice a threat? Like really, like I don't know, what does that mean? And they give no examples. But these things that are particularly subjective, and many people cite the cause for the school to prison pipeline to be these zero tolerance policies. We're afraid of school shooters. You can't bring a knife or a gun as part of a Halloween costume. Like zero tolerance, zero tolerance, zero tolerance. What it means is we're just getting kicked out. That's what it means, zero tolerance, kicked out. And justice isn't meant to act and operate like that. It just isn't. The Lady Justice, she's blind, she holds the scales, and equity is supposed to be the operating principle. It is not supposed to be just a broad-based flat line, because that's when harm really results. The other thing you need to do is, of course, look at the school setting. Many schools have school resource officers. Some are there, they're police officers, they're trained law enforcement personnel. Some of them are grant money, some are not. School resource officers and teachers really are good people. They really are. They're not really out to harm people. But what happens is when a teacher loses control of a student's behavior in the classroom, the now default is to call the school resource officer. And because they're law enforcement, when you're a hammer, everything is a nail, okay? And those schools that have school resource officers report a larger documented increase in school-based arrests. And school-based arrests largely affect Black and Hispanic students, primarily boys, but you know, us black girls get it too with our sassy head rolls. You know, you talking to me? And then we, you know what I mean? I mean, there's studies there that we get kicked out equally, okay, for things that are culturally appropriate, but deemed unacceptable. And there are studies that show just a small number of teachers generate the largest number of referrals. So it's not as if you're getting all of the teachers in mass sending students to the principal's office or arresting them. It's a small number of teachers. So get to know these people. Get to know them and educate them. I heard in yesterday's plenary session that it takes intentionality to talk about race because people are uncomfortable about it, but unless you do that, we're not going to be able to move forward. And let people know that there's no shame in not knowing what they don't know. A lot of people are afraid to talk about race because they don't want to be offensive. They don't want to be called out, especially now on social media when people can, anonymously attack you. People now want to retreat. They don't want to put themselves out there. But create a safe space in your local communities. And if you live there, even if you don't have children, you're a part of the community. You pay taxes. You have a voice. You have a voice. And remember how this country was founded. This country was founded in an act of anarchy. If you read the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, it talks about in the course of human events, it becomes necessary to dissolve the bands of power because the colonists from England felt oppressed by the government of England. And so they declared themselves that the government of England was destructive of the ends of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And because of that, the founding fathers of the country separated from England, an act of total anarchy. So remember, it's we, the people, that control the government, not the other way around. So say it with me. Say, we the people. We the people. We the people. We the people. One more time. We the people. Take that strength into your communities. We control what happens in our communities. Despite what everyone says, you can't fight City Hall. We are City Hall. We are the schools. And if you're courageous enough to save our black boys and young men, we can absolutely stop the pipeline. Thank you.